300 kilometers an hour. The bullet train carved a path through the mountain pass, while a violent storm hammered the glass. Outside, the world was a blur of black rock and white rain. Inside, the cabin hummed with a synthetic, steady pulse. Then, the lights flickered. Jax looked up. Above the rows of seats, the fluorescent strips stuttered, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. He glanced at the wall-mounted gauge. The needle twitched, nudging past 25 degrees. Beside him, Lena shifted in her seat, her notebook moving rhythmically as she fanned the air. The space felt tighter than it had 10 minutes ago. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of recycled ozone and trapped breath. Jax turned his gaze to the ceiling vents, his jaw tightening. He reached up, feeling for a draft that was no longer there. The steady, cool flow had slowed to a stagnant crawl. The heat was not just rising. It was settling into the cabin, heavy and oppressive. He pressed his palm against the plastic paneling. It was warm to the touch. He leaned toward Lena, his voice low and sharp. "The system is struggling," he whispered. "If the cooling fails in this pressure, we are trapped in a furnace." A metallic thump echoed through the car, vibrating through the floorboards. The constant hum of the ventilation died instantly. Silence replaced the white noise, thick and sudden. Jax stood up, his hand gripping the seat back as the cabin temperature spiked. 32 degrees. The air became stagnant, pulling the moisture from the passenger's skin. A child whimpered in the corner, the sound thin and sharp. People shifted, pulling at their collars, faces slick with sweat. In the control carriage, Ramirez stared at the dashboard. The entire console glowed a malignant, pulsing red. He slammed his hand against the panel, his fingers hovering over the emergency radio. He keyed the mic, his voice tight, stripped of all professional calm. "Central, we have a total failure. HVAC compressor is dead. Outside, it is 42 degrees with 90% humidity. We are losing the cabin temperature fast." He looked at the chronometer, his pulse hammering against his throat. "We have 47 minutes until the next station. If the cooling does not restart, this car will become a pressure cooker." The radio crackled with static, offering no response. Ramirez dropped the handset, his eyes locked on the rising numbers. The temperature was climbing, and the train was still tearing through the storm. Jax did not wait for an announcement. He lunged for the service hatch in the ceiling, his fingers prying the metal panel until it groaned and snapped open. He grabbed Lena by the wrist, pulling her close as he pointed into the dark, labyrinthine cavity of pipes and wires. "You want a story? Look at this," he snapped. "This is not just air, it is life support." Below them, the cabin air was turning into a physical weight. A man in the third row let out a strangled gasp and slumped into the aisle, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. Panic surged through the crowd, voices rising in a jagged, desperate chorus. Jax ignored the chaos, his focus entirely on the exposed guts of the machine. "The compressor is the heart," he shouted over the rising wails, his voice cold and precise. "It crushes refrigerant gas until it screams with heat. That heat travels to the condenser coils on the roof, where the wind strips it away. The gas turns to liquid, a heat sponge, and flows back down." He reached into the compartment, his hands steady as the thermometer hit 35 degrees. The liquid hits the expansion valve. Pressure drops, it turns to cold gas, and floods the evaporator coils. If that flow stops, we cook. The train screamed into the tunnel. Sunlight vanished, replaced by the suffocating darkness of the mountain interior. The last flicker of the cooling system died with a final, grinding whine. The cabin temperature surged to 37 degrees. Jax did not hesitate. He jammed his kit into the overhead space and hauled himself into the ceiling crawl space. It was a furnace up there. Lena followed, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the stagnant, superheated air. Jax moved with frantic, jerky motions, his fingers scraping against jagged metal edges until blood began to bead on his knuckles. He ignored the pain, his eyes scanning the network of copper lines. There, a hairline fracture hissed, a thin, needle-like jet of vapor spraying into the dark. "The system is a closed loop," Jax grunted, his voice raspy from the heat. "Compressor, condenser, expansion, evaporator. One leak kills the cycle." He reached into his kit and pulled out a heavy recharge canister. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the work. "If I screw this up, the compressor seizes," he warned, his jaw set. He pressed the nozzle against the metal, his grip tightening as he prepared to force the valve. Jax jammed the nozzle against the fracture, his muscles corded as he wrenched the fitting tight. The metal groaned under his grip. He twisted the recharge valve, his eyes locked on the pressure gauge as it spiked. Outside, the train shrieked, tearing out of the tunnel and back into the driving rain. The sudden change in light washed over the ceiling panels, blindingly bright. Jax held his breath, his chest heaving, listening to the silence of the machine. The compressor sat motionless, a dead weight of iron and copper. He tapped the gauge, his thumbs slick with sweat. Then, a deep, mechanical growl vibrated through the ceiling grid. It started as a low, agonizing shudder that rattled the entire service hatch. The fans caught. They whirred, pitched up, and finally roared into a steady, powerful hum. A sudden, violent blast of frigid air erupted from the vents, cutting through the stagnant heat like a blade. The temperature gauge needle twitched, then began a rapid, steady descent. 35 degrees, 32, 28. The oppressive atmosphere in the cabin shattered, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of cold air. Jax slumped back against the vibrating frame, his lungs finally drawing in a breath that did not burn. Below in the cabin, the collective tension broke. Passengers leaned back, some sobbing, others simply closing their eyes as the air grew crisp and cool. Lena slumped against the side wall, her notebook forgotten on the floor, watching Jax crawl down from the ceiling access. He landed on the floor with a heavy thud, his skin pale and glistening with sweat. He did not move for a moment, simply lying there as the rhythmic, metallic pulse of the cooling system filled the quiet. Lena looked down at him. "You saved us with a physics lesson," she said. Jax reached for a rag and wiped the dark grease from his fingers, his movements sluggish and heavy. He listened to the steady hum of the fans overhead, a sound that meant the difference between survival and disaster. "At 300 kilometers an hour," he murmured, his voice steadying, "the difference between a routine journey and a tragedy is just a bit of cold air." Outside, the blur of the storm slowed. The train lights flickered, stabilized, and cast a bright, steady glow across the aisle. The brakes hissed, a long, controlled sound, as the platform lights appeared through the rain-streaked windows. The train glided to a complete stop, the nightmare of the heat locked away behind the cooling vents.